This is no longer just a Middle East flashpoint. This is now a live test of how far a regional war can spread before it starts shaking the global economy, energy markets, military alliances, and the daily lives of people far beyond the battlefield. Because tonight, the Strait of Hormuz is still at the center of the storm. Missiles are still flying. World powers are still maneuvering, and the risk is no longer limited to Iran and Israel. What is unfolding now is a confrontation with military, diplomatic, and economic fronts all moving at once. And every one of them points to the same hard truth. This crisis is getting wider, more dangerous, and far more difficult to contain. Iran is now openly warning the United Nations Security Council against what it calls provocative action ahead of a delayed vote on a draft resolution tied to protecting commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. According to AFP, that vote was supposed to authorize member states, acting alone or through voluntary multinational naval partnerships, to use necessary and proportionate defensive measures to protect vessels and keep maritime traffic moving through the strait and nearby waters. That matters because this is not a technical dispute. This is about whether the world is prepared to back a defensive maritime operation in one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through that corridor. If Hormuz is obstructed, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It moves into fuel prices, shipping rates, supply chains, inflation, and political pressure in capitals around the world. Iran's foreign minister warned that any provocative move connected to Hormuz would only complicate the situation further. And that warning came as the Security Council reportedly postponed its vote, with diplomats citing scheduling issues around the Good Friday holiday in New York. But the delay itself may be only part of the story, because behind that pause is a much bigger question: whether major powers, especially Russia and China, are willing to back even a narrowly framed defensive mandate. The language of the draft was reportedly softened to make it more acceptable. References to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which can authorize the use of armed force, were removed. The latest version reportedly emphasizes the defensive nature of any intervention. Even so, China has warned that allowing member states to use force could legitimize unlawful and indiscriminate violence and drive the crisis into even more dangerous territory. And that is where things get even more volatile, because this is no longer only about a shipping blockade. Iran and Israel are still trading blows, and according to Iranian and Israeli media reports, a new wave of Iranian missile attacks was launched toward Israeli territory. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said the strikes were part of another phase of its ongoing campaign and claimed millions of Israelis were forced into shelters. Iranian state-linked media also claimed coordinated attacks involving allied fronts, including Yemen. Israeli forces said missile launches were detected, air defense systems were activated. Some of the battlefield claims remain difficult to verify independently, and the full picture is still unfolding. But even the claims themselves are strategically significant. They show how Tehran wants this conflict understood, not as an isolated exchange, but as a pressure campaign across multiple fronts, from Israel to the Gulf, from shipping lanes to American-linked infrastructure. That broader pressure is becoming harder to ignore. According to reports carried by Iranian media, the IRGC said it struck facilities linked to major American technology companies in the Gulf, including a cloud computing center in Bahrain and another site in Dubai. Bahrain accused Iran of attacking businesses operating on its territory. Amazon declined to comment in the report. Dubai denied that one of the facilities had been hit. But whether every detail is confirmed or not, the signal from Tehran is unmistakable. If the war continues, Iran may increasingly target the Ekanapertak not Joltukt. And for Washington, that changes the calculation. Because a conflict that begins with missiles and naval threats can rapidly turn into a wider contest over energy infrastructure, logistics hubs, data centers, financial risk, and market confidence across the Gulf. A UN development assessment cited in the reporting warned that the economic damage across Arab states could run into the hundreds of billions of dollars, with growth falling sharply as energy flows, trade routes, and financial markets are disrupted. At the same time, Iran's military leadership is escalating its rhetoric. Iran's army chief reportedly warned that if the United States launches a ground campaign, no invader should expect to survive. Iran's foreign minister has also suggested Tehran believes it is better prepared for ground warfare than many outside powers assume. That alone would be serious. But the consequences could go much further. Because even if Washington does not intend a full-scale ground invasion, military buildups and battlefield messaging can create exactly the kind of miscalculation that turns into disaster. And there's another layer here. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has reportedly offered to share Kiev's experience in defending maritime routes in the Black Sea as countries look for ways to reopen Hormuz. That is a striking development. Ukraine, a country at war in Europe, is now presenting its naval drone and maritime defense experience as part of the solution to a crisis in the Gulf. This is the point where a regional crisis starts becoming a global one, with lessons, technology, and strategic doctrine crossing theaters in real time. Meanwhile, the political strain inside the Western alliance is growing. Two U.S. senators, Democrat Jeanne Shaheen and Republican Tom Tillis, issued a joint statement warning that any president who tries to pull America a meta idea would damage U.S. national security and benefit adversaries like Russia and China. Their statement came after President Donald Trump repeatedly threatened to reconsider America's role in the alliance amid the Iran crisis and frustration over ally burden sharing. Under U.S. law, he cannot unilaterally without congressional approval. That legal backstop means that's alliance credibility ascent is its strategic asset. NATO is also moving ahead with a major round of military exercises across the Arctic, the Baltic region, and Poland, involving thousands of American and allied troops, along with drones, Patriot systems, and AI-enabled command and control tools. Officials say the goal is to strengthen readiness and deterrence on the alliance's eastern flank. In other words, while the Middle East burns, Europe is signaling that it will not look away from Russia either. Moscow, for its part, is calling for de-escalation. Russia's ambassador to the United Nations warned the U.S. and Israel not to play with fire, and said the violence is already damaging food security, energy security, and the global economy. Russian officials say they are discussing Hormuz and regional stability with Iran, while denying reports that Moscow is feeding Tehran intelligence to target U.S. forces. At the same time, Russia is projecting itself as both crisis manager and strategic opportunist, even sending oil to Cuba as country struggles under what Russian officials as a spells at its back but the real human cost may be on the water. Nearly 20,000 sailors are reportedly stranded in or around the Gulf, with many trapped by the danger around Hormuz. Some crews have watched missiles hit targets nearby. Others are sleeping outside their cabins, afraid they could become the next target. Maritime welfare groups say sailors are calling hotlines terrified, desperate, and in some cases talking about harming themselves. For many of them, especially Filipino seafarers supporting families back home, this is not just a security crisis. It is a survival crisis. That is why a phone call between the foreign ministers of Iran and the Philippines matters more than it might seem. Manila says Tehran assured it that Philippine-linked ships carrying energy supplies and Filipino sailors themselves would be allowed safe and rapid passage through Hormuz. For the Philippines, which depends heavily on Middle Eastern energy, that is not a diplomatic footnote. It is a lifeline. And still, the biggest question remains unanswered. What does Washington do next? One analysis cited in the reporting says the United States may have 4 broad options, and none are clean. A limited ground operation to seize key coastal or nuclear-related sites would be extraordinarily risky and could send oil prices soaring. Declaring victory and pulling back could invite renewed conflict later. Returning to negotiations may buy time, but it may also allow Iran to regroup. Continue military operations without a ground invasion risks draining U.S. stockpiles while inflation and field gas. So that is where this crisis stands tonight. A delayed UN vote, a threatened waterway, missiles over Israel, pressure on U.S. assets, trapped sailors, rising alliance tensions, and no clear off-ramp in sight. The war is no longer sitting at the edge of the global system. It is pressing directly against it. And unless something changes very soon, the next shockwave may not come from the battlefield alone. It may come from the oil pump, the shipping lane, the trading floor, or the alliance table, where the cost of this conflict is only beginning to be counted.